Felt like 30 seconds, but it was really a minute. Now don't freak out because you can breathe. You don't have to present just yet. All right. You get a chance before you present your perspectives on coming together to some kind of understanding about multicultural education as a human right. You now get to have the opportunity to talk with Dean Rios and also Dean Dade about how they see multicultural education as a human right. So questions, and they've got 25 minutes with us, and then we're going to come back to this, and you're going to report out. Dean Rios, Dean Dade, you are on. I wanted to be a part of it.
Well, good afternoon.
See you.
Again, by just asking you all to mark February the 5th at 4 o'clock in your calendars. Dr. Joy Roy is going to be here. She's probably, I would say, one of the freshest, most provocative, engaging individuals talking about multicultural education that I've heard in several years. I listen to diversity a lot and hear a lot of speakers, and she's absolutely phenomenal. So it's going to be at the Viking Union multi-purpose room at 4 o'clock, 4 to 5:30. It's part of Western Reads, and if you get a chance, I think you'll really be impressed by what she has to share. So I want to put that plug in. That's also co-sponsored by the College of Ed, that particular event as part of Western Read. So I'm just going to say one thing, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. And maybe it'll be nice because, yeah, we can tag team this and kind of share, different points of view. I mean, one of the things that we talk about multicultural education is that there are multiple points of view and multiple perspectives and multiple ways of coming to know and understand. But really what I'd like you to do is just to say that really what was important here for me and my colleague, by the way, thank you for saying my name, but Susan Markus was one of my graduate students at the University of Wyoming I was working with. When I first presented the really rough outline in class, she was the only one of the students that said, hey, that's really interesting and I'd like to talk more about it. So none of the other students said, I said, hey, you want to work with me on it and help me clarify and think through it? And she said, sure. Anyway, Susie Markus is an important part of this story. But I was really struggling with the ways that we frame. How do we think about this kind of stuff? I mean, because how we frame it, how in our minds we do this, really sets up, in many ways, how you develop a whole system of thoughts about that, but then that impacts how you feel and it impacts how you behave. And so I was really struggling with the fact that I was reading all these articles all the time, and everybody's always saying about this demographic imperative, this change in the face of our student population, and what are we going to do about this? And almost always coupled with, and there's these academic achievement gaps, and I was like, oh man, again, another one. I mean, can we get off of this? And thinking about maybe we need to reframe this as really anti-colonialist work, right? Moving away from thinking about this as a demographic imperative, or thinking about this in terms of developing cultural competency, but really thinking about this as really anti-colonizing work associated with really upsetting the legacy and the remnants of colonization. And we normally think about colonization of one nation and another nation, but several people were writing about internal colonization. How do we colonize people within our own shores, right? Mm-hmm. And we were thinking about that notion of colonization of the mind. Oh my gosh, colonization of the mind. Brilliant, because if you can colonize the mind, you don't need an army, right? You don't need an army to say, you should be doing this, you should assume that I'm better, you should assume my ways are better, my ways of thinking are better, because you just will buy into it because you're like, yeah, you're right, I colonize the mind. And schools played a major role in that colonization. Okay, I mean a major role. And so I was thinking about that, and then I was thinking about, but maybe it's not that necessarily, and it is both, all of those things, but maybe this is really fundamentally about a human right. These are really fundamental human rights. And maybe if we reframe this as not something that makes people feel good or we have this demographic imperative and that's why we should do it, but rather this is the right thing to do. This is the right thing to do in terms of what it means to be a human being who walks gently on the globe and on the planet. So really, that was really the impetus for this work. We just brainstormed and thought about stuff and looked at the literature and ran across this, oh my beautiful, absolute gorgeous statement of principles of cultural diversity that came out of UNESCO. I was floored when I first read it. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so wonderful in terms of what it's about. And so that became a really important part of the foundation of that work. And then really kind of playing it out with respect to the 7 dimensions. So, but all this is to say how you frame things, what's your large vision, what's your large perspective is so important. And you really need to think critically about what that frame is, because it's going to guide all the things that you think, feel, and do as an education professional.
Did you say you wanted?
Yeah. So now we'll, yeah, but I don't know if you wanted to say anything before we open it up for questions. Or
well, Dr. French asked me to speak about the interviews that were done with multicultural education scholars while we were at the NAME conference, and so maybe. Did anyone have anything to say with regard to?
Because we'll open it up for questions or comments. And by the way, feel free to push back or say I disagree with this, or you can say that in theory, but how does if you think about it in practice, here's a trouble. Here's how it troubles out.
And maybe I can segue from what you just presented, Francisco. Kristen asked me to speak on the interviews that I had the opportunity to conduct while I was at the NAME conference. The NAME stands for National Association for Multicultural Education. And I've actually been a member of NAME since 1993 when I was a graduate student. I started going. And there was an absolutely wonderful thing that happened in that first year of attending NAME, is that all of the books that I had been reading about multicultural education, I actually got to meet many of the authors right there at that conference. And the other thing is that they were all very approachable. And so we as students could go and just discuss, well, what did you mean about this in the book? And what about that? And, when we talk about putting in all the issues regarding, as we're looking at various multicultural kinds of issues, if we put that all into one idea or concept, doesn't that dilute, the struggles and trying to address those struggles when we put everything in the same pot and just kind of all these different discussions? And it was just really, really wonderful. And I think out of the 22 years that they've been in existence, I've probably gone to about 17 or 18 of those conferences. And so, and then a number of those scholars actually influencing my work as well. And one of those scholars, you're reading her book right now. Her name is Sonia Nieto, right? You're reading Affirming Diversity, probably the 9th edition by now, right? What is it? Sixth edition. And so Sonia was actually my former major professor, as well as your professor's former major professor. And so to be able to, in fact, what do they call us? The
Nietoistas.
And so in doing this particular segment at the conference, I'm also an associate editor for the International Journal for Multicultural Education. And it was through that work that we set up to do 8 interviews. And I just want to share with you who those scholars were that we interviewed. Of course, Sonia was one of them. How many of you know Carl A. Grant's work by now?
Well,
Okay, right.
those are I was mentored by Carl Grant and Kristen.
Yeah, that's right.
So
and she was also interviewed as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, we have Francisco Rios, who's one of our scholars who we interviewed, and Rose Duhan-Sells, who was the founder of NAME, and she talks a bit about, just trying to put together an organization and why she put that organization together, because the doors were shut When we were talking about multicultural education, they were talking about multicultural education back then. No one wanted to hear it. No one had any respect for it as an academic discipline that was developing. They talked about it not having any research, not being research-based, not having empirical evidence, and now you can see volumes and volumes of research works as well as research dictionaries. 1-2 who have recently published in the new James Banks encyclopedia. Okay, and so, but back then there were all of these types of just negative feelings around this particular field that you're studying today. And had to have her talk about that and how she was able to open doors through developing this organization is just very powerful. And I think we just put her interview up last week. Christopher Kumoshero, who is now he's the current president for NAME, and I consider him just a young and upcoming brilliant scholar in the field of multicultural education. As well as Christopher Noss. Christopher is he's also an associate editor for the journal that I'm on, and just some of the very provocative things that he discusses in the interview I think that you're going to enjoy. I'm going to make sure to put the website address on it. You can follow the interviews we're putting on one a week. We did 8 interviews. The other includes, have any of you heard of Donna Goldnick before? See, and these are, I hope that you will go back as you look at these interviews and follow the work of these great scholars, because they gave us the foundation for what you study now. They gave us the foundation to really get going. And one of the things that Donna Goldnick really helped to do, along with her usual co-author, Philip Chin, they wrote about multiculturalism in a pluralistic society and what it meant. And we weren't really, back when they came up with this idea and notion, we weren't really discussing it from that context, and so they really brought that out as well. So I think I've mentioned all of the 8 scholars. The focus of the interviews was looking at multicultural education, past, present, and future. And so when we think about the past, when we think about the idea of multicultural education, can you share with me, anyone in here, when did you think that got started, this idea of multicultural education? Because if you're reading Mantel's book and Banks' book, you should have a clue.
I think that its current form, the 80s and 90s, but similar programs and similar research has been going on since I think the turn of the century.
Right, excellent, and that's exactly what the scholars discussed as well. As they said, well, now if you're calling me the pioneer, I don't know if that is true. Because yes, I was around in the 70s and the 80s, but we have to go back before then. We have to look at intercultural education of the 1920s. We have to look at the work of Carter G. Woodson. We talk about when we're looking at ethnic studies, which is an area that James Banks is very strong in. How did this concept of ethnic studies, where did that begin to then, sort of filter into this multicultural education piece? So it's very, very important, and I know you've heard this before. It's very important to understand your past to know where you're going presently and in the future. So I would really, suggest to you strongly that you kind of look at the developments. And in my estimation, well, at least the idea of multiculturalism, it goes way back, before the inception of the United States and beyond. And so if we were to take it to that point, but when we talk about it as an academic discipline in a social movement, we can certainly start in those particular arenas. They talked about the current day, and I think you're getting a lot of that right now through the class that we're taking with Professor French. So I want to jump to the future and what some of the scholars were saying around what's to be expected for future. When we looked at look at multicultural education as an academic discipline, and a lot of the scholars coming right out of the U.S., it's been very domestic oriented. Okay, so we've really looked at the issues that basically pertain to what's going on within our country. But more and more as we go on, I mean, the globe is a small place, and we're all interconnected through all kinds of multicultural issues. And so how can we ignore that? And so the movement is thus that we are really expanding to become much more global. And how do we do that as a paradigm shift is where we're at presently in thinking about it. By way of future, it will be really changed to be oriented much more in that way, I think. One of the scholars talked about the term multicultural education. It probably won't be that term because so many of us are stuck on terms. We forget the fact that what Sonia Nieto says, what does she say about multicultural education? And you can relate this to my point about it being a term.
So it's really broad.
Okay, it's broad. And it's also a process. It's going to evolve. So it may not have the name multicultural education, but it will still mean that. So whether or not you're calling it cross-cultural studies or if you're calling it something totally out of my brain at the moment, it still will reside in our understanding of multicultural education. And so I thought that that was a very good point to think about in future, that this may not even be called, multicultural education, but whatever it is, this, what you're doing right now, will still exist, and we hope that it will even be better. So that's a little bit about some of what the scholars were focusing on related to the past and present and future. And like I said before, I'm going to go ahead and put the web address on there, and you can actually follow the interviews, which are incredible, absolutely incredible.
Do you want to give me the website so I can put it up for everyone
Sure,
right
you
now?
want to put it up there?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's IJME.
Hold on.
ME, which stands for, so it's International Journal for Multicultural Education, IJME,
Okay.
hyphen, journal,
Okay.
dot, blogspot, .com.
That's an earth-shaking website.
Yeah. Wow, that means you really have to go to this site and check it out. And so the blog site is it's its inaugural issue. It's the first time. Not many referee journals have a companion site that's a blog site where you can actually get video and audio and sort of chat comments, by way of pages of this to be able to communicate. So using some social media to really get people involved as well. And it actually has memberships in over 70 countries, so you'll find that the journal's very interesting. But this is the site for the blog, and that's where the interviews are. And do put in your comments once you go to those pages.
Great. Well, we'll open it up for comments, questions, opinions, perspectives, evaluations, money.
Any donations?
Donations. Yes.
The Dean Donation Fund.
Right.
Starving deans.
Karen, I just wanted to share that, because I'm old, and in the 80s I had moved to Oregon to get certified. And I couldn't get certified in the state of Oregon unless I took a multicultural class. That was in 1980. And so it was like, okay, multicultural, and I had to take a whole semester class before I could get certified. So I just wanted to share that,
And that was good, especially in the 80s, because that was not something that was a requirement for certification. It still isn't necessarily in many places.
The first one that I took was called intercultural education. And there's a great seminal work by a guy named Gordon Allport called The Nature of Prejudice, 1950s. And he was writing about, several people were writing about segregation and integration and why people develop, how people as individuals develop biases and prejudices. Why do they do that? what does it serve for them, and how does it show itself? And there's a seminal work. Most people today move out of the individual level, because that focused on what does an individual develop biases and prejudices and discriminate, and much more people are focusing on what policies and practices encourage individuals or allow individuals to act in discriminatory or prejudicial ways. And they look at a lot around narrative and discourse and dialogue. How do we talk about it? How does that set up? So for example, the discourse around Obama's election and people saying, well, you know, clearly racism's dead. We've elected the first, you know, we've elected an African American person as the president. There was a lot of people that, especially after the first, after winning the first time, were suggesting that. But that becomes part of that narrative, that story. Somebody's trying to suggest that we no longer have to attend to issues of racism and bias and discrimination. And then beyond that, people are really looking at ideological orientations. What are the underlying ideologies, epistemologies, right? What are those underlying ideologies, and how do they, so while we still look at why does one individual make a racist remark against another individual, we're trying to understand it much more broadly in terms of these institutional narrative, dialogue, and ideological lenses that suggest it's okay to do that, or you can hold that viewpoint.
You know, and I think what a couple of the scholars had a little bit of fear around not putting these very real issues on the table, that multicultural education would become sort of this sort of watered down version of, and we've always talked about this with multicultural education, the feel-good aspects of multicultural education, opposed to really, and again going back to Nieto, since you're reading her particular book, and in her characteristics as she defines multicultural education, she talks about it being for social justice. And so leaving that out to simply celebrate the heroes and holidays, as James Banks talks about in his levels of integration, right? And so again, one of the biggest fears is not putting those things on the table each and every time we address it. So not to forget that.
So if you know, a great I think movement in the field probably in the last 7 or 8 years is to, a lot of people are now talking about critical multicultural ed, to distinguish it from that food, fashion, folklores, and festivals approach, to really thinking critically about these issues. And so some great scholars are writing a couple, 3 or 4 new books are out on critical multicultural ed. So that's kind of where like the cutting edge of stuff that's being done right now.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things for me as I, you know, as becoming a doctoral student and having my area of specialization be multicultural education, and as I was inquiring whether or not if I wanted this to be my program, right? And so I remember having this conversation with Sonia, and I said, you know, multicultural education, I'm really about focusing on looking at how racism impacts our students' learning and development, and in particular African American students. And I don't think I can do that in a multicultural education program because it is so focused on the issue of racism and looking at a particular culture. How can that be multicultural education? And you know, if you know Sonia, you know that she gave me you know, a pretty sharp answer to that, and I ultimately ended up you know, in the multicultural education program. But it is that, you know, one can be focused in a particular area and still embrace the concepts and understanding of multicultural education, for which I had to learn that.
Good. Well, other questions or comments, or somebody wants to share something that you're thinking about or you're struggling with? I'd love to hear from you all.
I'd like to ask a question. I don't even know if I know how to frame it, but you were talking about, you know, this is an international journal and that multicultural education is focusing on the international now, and it's a new paradigm. So I guess my question is kind of like what you posed to Sonia was, okay, so you're interested in how racism impacts students. So I don't quite understand what this international multicultural education is and what's its focus or what we're trying to learn from it or do with it. But for me, I'm very much sort of stuck in this country in a way, in the issues and problems that we have that haven't been adequately addressed, or we've got a long ways to go. So I guess I'd like you to speak to that, because I'm very fuzzy about it.
Yeah, good question too. And I'll take it from two different perspectives. One, in just doing, we do a lot of work outside of this country in multicultural education, and there are many universities and school systems that are adopting models of multicultural education that actually stem originally from the United States. And what they're doing is they are, taking those concepts and making it a part of their curriculum, and oftentimes adjusting it, adapting it to fit into what their national and local needs are within their country. So from that perspective, the interest in multicultural education as an academic discipline is globally spread. Okay. So that's one aspect of it. The other part of that is, in part to what you've asked about, is what is the relationship between our domestic issues and global issues. And more we'll find that we have so many similarities as it relates to struggles, and that oftentimes when we unite, numbers we become stronger often. And so it's kind of the concept of saying, when we look at human trafficking, which I know that's an issue that Karen looks at, or if we're looking at racism in many different forms. So if we take that to India, we're looking at the caste system, but we can relate the caste system to what's happening by way of race in this country, by way of racism in Australia or South Africa or whatever. So these are issues that we can put on the table in a very global way and have a much stronger voice as relates to the human rights of all of us. And so that gives us some leeway to be able to do that as well. So looking domestically, but also knowing what's going on in the rest of the world, and how do we begin to link a network to make a stronger voice in action.
I'm curious too, just another little question is, perhaps the research that other countries are doing might inform us better about certain things. I don't know. Has that come up?
Yeah, most definitely. And I think one of the biggest things is, and this is just the American way, is that, and how other countries see us, that we're very arrogant. We always go places and think we know it all, and we're going to tell someone else how to do it. And so multicultural education should be just the other way. It should be the other way around. And learning of other cultures, respecting those cultures, and seeing what those cultures need for us to be able to work together. So, I don't know, Francis, what did you think?
No, I think that's it. I mean, when I was at the conference in November, the only book I purchased, I think I might have purchased a couple of books. One of them was called Precarious International Multicultural Education. A person I'd worked with in Australia, Michael Singh, fabulous, brilliant guy, was one of the authors of it, where they recognize that we can't just come in and assume, make all kinds of assumptions that this is a very precarious work. And I didn't get a chance to read the book yet, but because she stole it from me. I put it right by her, and she looked at it. She's like, "Oh, this looks good." And then, "Can I borrow it?" And I said, "Sure, go ahead." So, but I think that notion of that this work, we have to be gentle. We have to be careful with how we do this work, because we do have that history of colonization and that a very Americentric, North American, continent-centric way of thinking about the world.
And we do it to our own children right here, right? How often do we take into consideration who they are, where they come from, before, and try to teach from those perspectives rather than from our own?
Other questions, or I'm gonna have to leave in about 5 minutes, but are there other questions or comments or things somebody read that you're
Is
troubling
this the
about?
same class that I heard asking all of those questions when the interfaith panel came and?
This is a
No.
whole new one.
Oh, it's a
And
new
they're all
class.
talky too.
Because that was last quarter,
Yeah.
wasn't it? Okay,
No, but
all right.
they have questions.
Okay, because I'm like, ooh, I
Oh,
was,
yeah.
oh, I thought I
Like,
had
oh,
some questions.
that's
Yeah.
Whew, remember that song?
Supporting work is hard enough here.
So, I mean, I guess I have a question. I know, Dr. Dade, you mentioned that terminology can be sort of arbitrary, but I noticed, he's walking out now, but in the article that we read, maybe you can answer this. In the article we read for class that Dean Rios wrote with Susan Markus, I believe her name was, there were so many terms thrown around that I think have this richness, and they're so big, and I don't know that I fully understand a lot of this. There was like pluralism, there was cosmopolitanism, there was the term interculturality, which Dean Rios brought up a couple minutes ago. And I was wondering if you could talk about the difference in those terms and what they all mean, and sort of explain the richness to us.
Yeah, you know, we actually, it's funny, and I guess you can look this up as well, and I'm not quite sure if they did a new edition, but we actually created a multicultural education dictionary. And, you know, it was a dictionary not only because people had those same questions. Well, okay, well, when you're talking about pluralism, you know, is that the same as multiculturalism? What's the difference between that and so and so and so and so? And so what the dictionary was to help to do was not to set things in stone, but to see that there may be some slight differences in how we use particular terms, and here's some, you know, sort of suggestions and layout of that. I would definitely tell you, if you went to the regular Webster's dictionary, you would not see those differentiations. You know, but so he asked, as far as terms are concerned, where he's reading your article, and there are many different terms that are stated within that, and how do you actually know what those mean, you know, in relation to one another? Are they that far different from one another, or so? I think that's a great question. So I was telling him about the dictionary for multicultural education that Carl Grant did a while ago, and I don't think that they did another addition to
and
that.
I think the name
but
webpage has, I think, a place for definitions and terms. But I mean, you know, I don't think, and I agree with Karen, the intent is not to say this is the end all and be all definition. We think about these as working definitions, or this is how we mean it. Somebody else might mean it a little differently, but just so that way you, when you're reading the working, you're like, oh, that's what they mean by that. So.
Yeah, and so when you're reading different kinds of things, you'll often find, especially if they're books, you'll find a glossary of terms in those books, which is it's nice to really take a peek at that and to see what they meant with that, and then compare them with another reading that might say something different. It still gives you that sense of what's going on, and then just putting things into context as you're reading, even to see what they're saying with regard to that.
Scott?
I was going to say is, would you say one of the problems why this has not gotten, well, it's gone underway, but not gotten so much farther is the problem of organization and not being able to really bring it all together and state what needs to be, like, I guess to organize exactly how we want to define and say a lot of these things so we can actually unify it.
Well, you know, for me, I think that as we looking at this in terms of a new academic discipline, which is a little bit different than going way back, but looking at this multicultural education as an academic discipline, I think it's one of the strongest academic disciplines that we've had come, you know, thus far in this century, as far as all of the development of its curriculum and its the fact that it's not only taught in college classrooms, but it's integrated, all of its multicultural concepts are integrated across curriculum in schools P through 12 and beyond. And the research, the empirical research that's become a part of multicultural education is also too very, very strong. I think where the breakdown is the breakdown of communication. This does exist, you know, as a very strong discipline, and how do we draw from that? And so I think that's probably the fuzziness.
And I probably, you know, for me, there's probably a question about will. You know, do we want this? I mean, do we really? I mean, you look at you know, is the Common Core when we had this new national curriculum? Was there somebody in there saying we need to make sure that this new standard curriculum is going to have diversity, or who was at the table when those discussions were being had and who wasn't at the table? And then I think it's also the will of individual teachers. I mean, you know, even if you have very few resources, even if the field was kind of muddled, and you really cared a lot about sustainability, you'd find a way to bring sustainability in because it was important to you. Or it could be global, international, global citizenship, or it could be democracy. So even if the definitions of what does it mean to be a democratic citizen were muddled, you'd still say, if this is really important to me, I'm not educating students just to be smart mathematically, you know, literate, etc. I want them to be good citizens. You'd find a way, even if there was no curriculum or whatever. So there's a lot of both individual will and institutional will that I think is probably the bigger.
Absolutely. And to just to piggyback on what Francisco said, is that I remember having to review the Common Core standards as they were being adopted by, you know, the governors of each state. And actually looking at it and having that issue around diversity. And, you know, what came to mind is, how is it that we have a comprehensive discipline such as, you know, multicultural education, and we have not adopted that as a national effort the way that we're adopting Common Core standards? Why isn't that happening? Why do I have to be called from India, Minister of Education, with an interest to make multicultural education, non-discriminatory education, you know, a national curriculum? Why am I doing that work in another country when in my own country we have yet to ever consider this becoming a national curriculum? You know, it's something to think about, especially when we talk about this as being a movement. It's not only a discipline, but it's also a movement, not a reform movement. We used to call it reform movement. Now we call it, it's transformation. How do we get there? You know, how do we get there by way of a movement? And it's a shame that, you know, we've had so many brilliant people and scholars help to, you know, just give so much input into this, and we see that it's being embraced around the world, but yet and still we haven't made it a national movement. It's interesting.
I guess, yeah, going right off of there, my biggest question that I've had, and there are a lot of examples of specific ways, but what do you think is the best way to implement these ideas in the school system? Do you think it should all be top down and having it in core curriculums, or do you think it should be more of a teacher's job and as their conscious effort to include those in the curriculum, or both? Or what do you think is the best way now and in the future to implement these ideas?
Yes. Right. I mean, we definitely need leadership at the top. We need, you know, superintendents, and we need teachers unions saying, you know, community board members saying, look, we're preparing our students not only for democratic citizenship, we're preparing them for global citizenship. And what does that imply in terms of how we feel about both ourselves and how we feel about people who are both like us and people who are not like us? And so we definitely need that leadership voice, because they control resources, they control structures, they control policies, they control practices, and all of those things make it easier for you to do the job. But it also absolutely has to come up from the bottom. It has to come up from people who are passionate, who say, this is what I'm about, this is how I see myself, my whole identity is around affirming diversity. I love that term that Sonia Nieto uses. My whole identity is around affirming diversity. It's about listening to students' lives. I'm not going to try to, you know, tell students what their cultural identity is. I want to invite them in to share with me how that cultural diversity plays out in their life. What does that mean for them? I want to co-construct the curriculum. You know, one thing that I really was trying to encourage people to do is, in the last kind of major talk that I had with teachers was I said, will you address one topic with your students that you do not have the answer to? Please, just one, just try it once, just give it a try. Say, I don't know the answer to this. Here's a really important question. And how do the students, and have the students work with you to try to answer that question. That's the knowledge construction, right? The co-construction of knowledge. And students begin to say, you mean I can produce knowledge too? And I can be an active agent in my own education? I mean, brilliant kinds of stuff, right? So that's why I said yes. It definitely needs to come. You need those leaders. You need the people at the top saying, we need to have this. And then you need it from passionate people like yourselves saying, you know what, this is so important. It's a human right, however you want to frame it, for whatever reason you want to frame it, but I care deeply about this and I'm really going to make it happen. And because it is a process, just recognize you're never there. You're never done. I'm not done. I still go to the conference. I go to sessions. I listen to people. I mentioned I'm going to go hear Joy DeGroy because she's so brilliant. She's making me think about things. I'm buying books about precarious international multicultural education because I'm still learning. You're never there, but it's the journey. And it's knowing that you're on the right path. That's the most important thing. I'm going to have to take my leave. So, but thank you. And maybe there'll be another opportunity.
Yeah.
I think you need to know as they're, leaving that we are doing it both ways because we've had people at this university who've been fighting for getting leaders and scholars on this campus, and we have two of the most incredible multicultural scholars as the leaders of this college. So I think that we've come a long way and we're doing great things. So I just want to thank you both. Thank you so much. Okay.
Well, yeah. I think just in answer to that last question as well, is that how many of you are, because I know you kind of do a cross class, they're not all in teacher education, right? So how many of you are in teacher education? Okay, so a lot of you. But I want to say this not only to you, but I want to say that to everyone here as far as your leadership, is that you may come across folks in your professions who may not support teaching in cross-cultural manners, or when we look at cross-culture, we talk a lot about cross-cultural responsiveness or competencies and those kinds of things, and you may not get support in your particular institution, school, or what have you, but you can always close your door, as many teachers do. And when you close your door and you're making sure that you are teaching the standard curriculums you're supposed to teach in the classroom, that curriculum you can make that curriculum multicultural and still teach what it is that what it is that's required of you to teach, but make sure that curriculum is a cross-cultural curriculum for students. So never think that because policy doesn't allow you to do this, or that you don't have the support by way of curriculum or whatever the case might be handed to you to do this, that you cannot do it and make a difference yourselves, okay? So you can make a difference yourself, you can make a difference as a larger, group of people, as human beings, but always know that we can do all of that. So don't be discouraged if you get into situations where you don't feel supported. You can still do those things on your own, okay? And I'll tell you, it goes a long way. Students will remember you because you'll help to change their lives and their perspectives. Okay, so I think if there are no other questions, I do want to mention it next week, right?
Yes.
Next week we are going to, I'm a part of a very small group. It includes our instructional technology director, Paula Dagner, and Greg, who is our technology director for the college, as well as two students, Nick and Courtney, and myself. We have been putting together a webinar that focuses on addressing youth violence. And so even when we're talking about multicultural education, you know, that's a part, when we talk about social justice, that is a part of that, you know. And so there's a real concern with what just goes on around the world as relates to youth violence, that we're seeking to get the younger generation's voices and ideas and ways to address and to develop youth forums, rather than to constantly look at adults for answering and solving youth issues. And so this webinar is going to focus on the first webinar, and it's made in-house, but it's going to focus on bullying. And I know that you probably, how many of you have had some class or some course or something to really take a look at the effects of bullying, right? And so I expected to see lots of hands go up. We are trying to look at we want to look at bullying from a race, class, and gender perspective. We're looking at it from a global perspective. We're looking at it in some different ways that I hope will intrigue you, as well as you know, stimulate you to want to think about ideas on how can we begin to address this globally. So next week, we're actually going to have an hour of your time in presenting this webinar, and it's going to be this class as well as Joanne DeMarc's leadership class. And we're trying to figure out, you're kind of our test case, because we want to see how the technology will work between the two of you. And once we have a sense of how that's going to work, we will then begin to make our contacts for our other students who are in colleges around the world. And so we'll be trying to connect Western students to a global forum on addressing youth violence through social media, webinars, and those kinds of things. And so we're going to test case you next week, if you don't mind. Okay. And so I think we're going to send you a couple of little things on how to get ready for the webinar. And it's just the start. We're starting with the bullying piece. Again, we're going to try to take it from a different type of perspective.
I'm wondering, because I've been very curious about bullying. I'm not going to be there, unfortunately, but I was hoping, I know, it's my job. Anyway, in terms of the bullying, like, is there going to be a conversation around, like, what types of bullying, or, because when you think of bullying, in my head, I think of, like, oh, the one in the playground that's just, like, kind of teasing the other kid, but I know there's other...
I mean, there's cyberspace bullying,
yeah.
all forms of bullying, and that's what we're hoping to generate discussion among, you know, our college students on what types of bullying that they say. I know Karen's been doing a lot of work on bullying. In fact, I looked at the PowerPoint and things. I think we probably should pull some facts just from that as well. But what class is that you're teaching, Karen?
It's the Compass to Campus, EDUC 202.
And was that just one, you know, classroom session on bullying, or is it throughout the?
It's one session, and it's also in 201 as well. Cindy teaches it as well. For our mentors when they go out into the schools.
And so there are some webinars, some formal webinars, which I was going to go ahead and purchase just to have it, but they're looking at bullying on college campuses, and I thought that was, you know, that might be something of interest as we look as a resource. So you might want to have that for the center, you know, to borrow that and to share. But just different aspects of bullying that we don't necessarily look at. How many of you, for instance, look at the impact of bullying as it relates to youth suicide? Good, yeah, because and that's kind of the direction that we're going in. So we're going to just present some cases, a video on some of the things, give you some examples, and some of it's kind of hard to watch, and then move ahead and have some serious discussion about it. So that's for next week. And then hopefully they can continue in some way, shape, or form on addressing that. And then we'd like to invite all of you to become a part of the initiative and Stop All Violence with Education. So, you know, to have that as an initiative right here in Woodring and have students become a part of that. So Thanks for allowing me to say my little thing at the end. Lots of wonderful things by way of speakers, as you know, Francisco mentioned with Joy coming. And there's just so many different events that are happening that I hope that, you know, U.S. students really plug into getting exposed to just all of the wonderful dynamic speakers and activities that are going on this quarter, really. So a lot of stuff going on this quarter, especially what happens in CEED. Yeah. So just thank you to these lovely ladies here. Thank you. Okay, have a good night, everybody. Nice talking to you.
Thanks for coming.
Oh, you brought my bag.
You know, how cool is that, that, you know, the two leaders in our college are, you know, nationally renowned scholars in the field of multicultural education, but, you know, it would cost us thousands of dollars to bring them here. So, yes. February 5th, I'll put it on Blackboard and remind you next